So welcome. I've put a note in the chat to ask you to include your name and your institution and your email address. That helps us to get the word out about our future webinars, and we'll share details about our upcoming planned webinars for the rest of the fall and into the new year at the end of this session. We're happy to see those of you who are able to be here in person. So many friends of the Women Scholars Network who are here across many time zones. And also to think about those who will tune in to this learning opportunity, still admitting people from the waiting room, this learning opportunity at other times once the video is made available. My name is Amy Alaco. I'm an associate professor of religious studies at Elon University in North Carolina in the United States, where I also direct the Multi-Faith Scholars Program. And I co-coordinate the Women Scholars Network of the IAHR, along with my colleague, Milda, who will introduce herself.
Welcome. I would like to say good evening because it's already dark behind my window, but I know that all of you are in the different time zones. So welcome to everyone. My name is Milda Lišauskienė. I'm a professor of sociology at Vytautas Magnus University in Lithuania. Currently, I'm working on the fellowship at Helsinki University. So I'm speaking to you from Helsinki. So really, it's a pleasure to see Professor Wilcox joining our webinar today, and really I'm looking forward to listen to your presentation and to discussion that will follow it. I'm really sure about this. So.
Thanks so much, Milda. It really is a pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Melissa Wilcox. We have long had the idea that we would invite her to present to this group, and we're really happy that it's come to fruition, and also for her enthusiasm about this invitation. Melissa Wilcox is professor and Holstein Family and Community Chair, as well as chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Riverside, here in the United States. So tuning in from Pacific time. Dr. Wilcox is a prolific and sought-after specialist in the study of gender, sexuality, and religion in the global North and the global West. She has dedicated significant time to serving her disciplinary associations in ways that have indelibly shaped her fields of expertise. Just in the American Academy of Religion, she was the founding chair of the Queer Studies in Religion group, co-chaired the Sociology and Religious group, and was the founding chair of the Committee on the Status of LGBTQIA Persons in the Profession. Dr. Wilcox's books include Coming Out in Christianity, Religion, Identity, and Community, Sexuality in the World's Religions, the award-winning Queer Women and Religious Individualism, Religion in Today's World, Global Issues, Sociological Perspectives, Queer Nuns, Religion, Activism, and Serious Parody, and then Queer Religiosities, an Introduction to Queer and Transgender Studies in Religion. And then most recently, a textbook co-authored with Nina Hull and Liz Wilson, Religion, the Body, and Sexuality. Dr. Wilcox's current project focuses on spirituality in leather and BDSM communities. She's currently in the research phase of a larger project to understand how leather folk and BDSM practitioners in general experience the intersections between their practices and religion. And she anticipates that the resulting monograph will be the first scholarly book on religion and spirituality in queer and trans leather and BDSM communities. Welcome, Dr. Wilcox. We're really excited to hear from you today.
Thank you so much. That was a very generous and kind introduction. And I also want to thank Amy and Milda for inviting me, and all of you for being here. I certainly recognize a number of the names in the room, and I'm honored to be speaking to all of you. I do want to say that I'm working on a new machine. So if you have any trouble with the video or the audio, my last one died an ugly death, and I had to quickly get this one set up over the weekend. If you have any trouble, please let me know. I'll be screen sharing in my previous version of Zoom on my old machine. Sometimes the chat showed up during screen share and sometimes it didn't. But I do invite you to drop quick questions into the chat. If you need me, I recognize we're working across a lot of languages here. If you need me to speak more slowly or to spell out a term that I haven't put on the slides, again, please let me know. I always tell my students I'm the kind of lecturer who would rather be interrupted while the question is fresh in your head than have you not answer a question. And I would certainly rather be redirected if I'm not speaking or presenting in a way that's helpful to you, rather than have you just not get much out of this entire experience. So that said, what I've been asked to do today is offer a framework, offer an introduction. So given the amount of time that we have, this is going to be a very high level introduction, not as in very fancy or erudite, but rather really skimming over the surface, because we're talking about an entire subfield here. And I want to do a little bit of framing with the larger subfields of religious studies that these come from. So I'm happy to address more in-depth questions in the Q&A. I'm going to be touching on a couple of them in the talk that I think tend to be of particular interest and tend to be particularly pressing questions for people who are new to these topics or newer to these topics. But again, gonna try to keep it short as possible and leave plenty of time for the Q&A. So let me go ahead and get these slides up and the slideshow started. Oh my goodness, and I'm getting all of these little announcements. Come on, run the show. There we go. Okay. All stuff having to do with setting up a new machine. So let me start first of all with some overview material looking at gender and sexuality studies, and particularly gender and sexuality studies in religion, which is of course what queer and trans studies in religion develop out of. So I've put this nice little drawing on the right to give you a sense of the points of overlap that I'm going to be talking about, both with women's studies and gender studies and with gay and lesbian studies and sexuality studies. So again, very quick overview of the history here. Gender studies, of course, develops out of women's studies, which has been underway for a couple of decades, 3 decades, depending on how you count, longer depending on who you consider to be the starting point, when gender studies begins to develop. There, as many of you know, particularly in the 1990s, there were quite a few tensions around the differences between women's studies and gender studies, and even the question of whether gender studies had adequate or appropriate space for women. Certainly, I was on the job market in the middle of a lot of the fights around what departments should be named, and was asked the hot potato question more than once of whether the department should be women's studies or gender and sexuality studies. The difference for me is that gender studies is focusing very specifically on what earlier scholarship called sex roles, asking questions about how societies understand different bodies, particularly bodies that differ along the lines of genitalia, reproductive abilities, and so on, how they understand those bodies to fit into a particular social structure, what the space is for variance or lack thereof. And that certainly includes studying women's gender. So there is an overlap between women's studies and gender studies. At the same time, there are forms of women's studies or approaches to women's studies that aren't specifically about gender, or again, as the older language had it, about sex roles. There are approaches to women's studies that are really focused on asking questions about women in history, about particular women's accomplishments, about certainly women in religion, women's leadership, the place of women in texts, the representation of women, Once we get into representation, we're often shifting into questions of gender. But my point here is that while these overlap, they do also have differences, and some of those questions that were raised in the 1990s and that are still raised by some people certainly were coming from some important spaces of concern. And the one that I've got here on the slides is the one that really has been a source of debate. Does gender studies erase or marginalize women? What happens when we shift from talking about women's studies, which was created for very specific reasons to address the fact that pretty much the entire rest of the academy at the time was men's studies? What happens when we shift from women's studies to gender studies? There certainly have been arguments that gender studies runs the risk in not highlighting women, in not talking specifically about women, of re-marginalizing women, of turning into another men's studies. It really hasn't turned out that way, in large part because a lot of the people doing gender studies are coming from women's studies and or feminist studies backgrounds. Also, for perhaps less happy reasons, the fact that because of the ways in which unmarked categories work, that a dominant category typically doesn't have to be described or flagged. In many cases when we talk, and therefore the people who are not part of the dominant category are flagged, when we talk about gender, many people assume that we're talking about women or sometimes about transgender people. So for that reason as well, gender studies has often ended up being the study of women, but also masculinity studies is very important, and gender studies is one of the fields that informed the development of trans studies also in the early 1990s. Likewise, for doing gay and lesbian studies versus sexuality studies, the shift happens roughly around the same time. And again, this is not a simple, forgive me if I'm giving you history that you already know, I'm trying to make sure we're on the same page here. But again, this is not a simple shift from, okay, we were doing gay and lesbian studies and now all of a sudden the world has changed and now we're all doing sexuality studies, but rather a slower change in paradigm that we can trace forerunners of coming up through the 1980s, and certainly a blending of approaches coming through the 1990s and still in existence today, although sexuality studies is much more the approach, is a more common approach taken today. Again, we see the same pattern of a shift from highlighting people who had been written out of history. Gay and lesbian studies starts in many ways for the same reason women's studies starts, because the rest of academia was straight studies, was heterosexual studies at the time. And as that work grows and spreads and becomes richer and deeper, people also start asking additional questions. And that's in many ways how we get to sexuality studies, as well as I'll get to on the next slide, to queer studies. So the first shift is going again from studying the people to studying the social roles, to asking more questions about how do different societies understand sexuality, what counts as sexuality and what doesn't, how do different societies shape or structure or construct sexuality. Likewise, sexuality studies, again, as with gender studies, includes but isn't limited to critical studies of the ways that sexuality works among the dominant group. So just as gender studies includes masculinity studies, sexuality studies includes critical heterosexuality studies, but at the same time isn't limited to it. I'm flagging that in part because of widespread assumptions outside of those of us doing this work that gender studies is about women and that sexuality studies is about queer folks, when in fact both are quite a bit broader. Gender and sexuality studies in religion, then, as many of you probably already know, are two very rich and broad and closely connected subfields in the study of religion. They explore the intersections between gender as a social role and religion as a social institution, for instance. Likewise, for sexuality, sexuality is a social role, and again, religion as a social institution. And one of the things that I often need to point out to my students and often find them quite startled by is the fact that this is not just a story about regulation. We can't leave the regulation aside. We can't leave the questions of oppression aside. But I find myself particularly interested in the stories about liberation, about resistance, about the creative new directions in which people can take religion as well as gender and sexuality, and the complicated patterns of negotiation that people engage in around the connections between religion, gender, and sexuality. So moving then to queer studies and transgender studies, a lot changes late 80s to early 1990s. Again, I don't want to see this as a paradigm shift that's similar to a gear shift in a car where you go from, especially if you are driving a manual or a stick shift, you go from third gear to fourth gear. And when you take the clutch back out and engage the gears, you're in a new gear and third gear is gone, or at least set aside until you're using it again. It's a much slower transition. Of course, gender studies and sexuality studies are still very much around. Some people consider trans studies a subset of gender studies, but a lot of trans studies scholars push back against that and want to see this as its own field of study. And I think that that's fair for a number of reasons that I can talk about in more depth. Likewise, with queer studies, people often want to see it as a subset of sexuality studies. Certainly, all of these fields tend to be lumped into one department if your school actually even has that department or non-departmental program. So queer studies is a term that's actually coined in the early 1990s as part of a conference at the University of California in Santa Cruz, up the coast from me, probably about an 8-hour drive. California is quite long. And it was named Queer Studies shortly before the development on the opposite coast of the United States of the activist group Queer Nation. They didn't know about each other at the time, and there have been interesting questions raised since then about whether one was named after the other. Most of the questions, of course, are whether the conference was named after the activist group, but in fact, the timeline doesn't work. What's happening instead is that there's a much broader movement in several Anglophone countries, in particular the US and the UK at this point, but it's also Canada, Australia, New Zealand in particular, that are trying to reclaim the word queer, which has been used pejoratively and not been a word that people wanted to use for themselves. But in the late 80s, it's particularly with the activism around HIV and AIDS, it starts to become a term that people are wanting to reclaim. In this time period, it also, in part because of this activist group called Queer Nation, at least in the United States, the word queer takes on a political aspect as well. So at that time, and for some of us who came of age at that time, the term queer was not just a way of saying, this is who I am in terms of my sexual identity, but it was a way of identifying with a radical or progressive politics as well, especially around the politics of sexuality. So queer studies in its early definition drew on older usages of the word queer in the English language. You can go through an entire Oxford English Dictionary entry, the entire entry on the word queer, and I do this often with my classes, and see the ways in which they're drawing most of those connections all the way down the list of definitions. You can see places where the people that framed out queer theory initially were building connections. These were literary scholars. The Oxford English Dictionary is a close companion of many Anglophone literary scholars. So it's not surprising that this connection happens. To nutshell it briefly for you, the strongest connection that queer theorists often make in terms of why queer theory uses the word queer, it's not just about queer people, or as I sometimes joke, add queers and stir. Instead, it's taking a different perspective on questions of sexuality, but also questions that might not look immediately as though they're directly about sexuality. And that's because they're drawing on the definition that I have written up here on the slide of queer as a verb, meaning to disrupt or to discomfit, to unsettle. So queer theory is working on unsettling assumptions, perspectives, approaches to the body, to sexuality, to desire, and to how we understand people, literature, non-human animals, the world around us, certainly religion, through these kinds of lenses. So there's also an important piece to the story that I, again, like to tell about queer theory. Some people would probably say I have too much faith in it, but I think that this is an accurate story about queer theory and what eventually comes to be called queer studies. So broader, not specifically theoretical work, although including theoretical work, but also ethnographic work, such as my own historical work, and work that blends those different approaches, as we're so familiar with in religious studies. Queer theory is originally coined. The term is coined and the concept is developed by Teresa de Lauretis as a way of pointing what was then gay and lesbian studies towards what we were just coming to call more intersectional approaches. So in the introduction to the journal issue, where some of the papers from the conference were published, this is in the journal Differences, de Lauretis writes about wanting to envision a gay and lesbian studies that thinks, she's not using the word intersectional or intersectionality, she hasn't read Kimberly Crenshaw's work, but that thinks about sexuality together with issues like race and class, that recognizes what, it should be said, feminists of color were already writing about in the 1980s, that recognizes that you cannot think about gender, sexuality, desire without also taking into account questions of race and class. And today we would, of course, list off a number of other factors, including religion, which is often left out of intersectional analyses or lists of the axes of power that intersectional perspectives engage with. But at the time, those were this, and the people that came to the conference see this as having a great deal of promise. Just 3 years later, she publishes another article, which, and then this is not the point of the article, but in the process of the article, she dismisses queer theory and completely disavows the term and calls it, and this is the quote that I have on the slide, forgive me, I'm not sure why I dropped off. Do you have me back?
Yes, we can see you, but we don't see your presentation.
Yeah, the slides dropped off. Let me just get back to that. Okay. You have the slides again?
Yep, we do.
Yes,
Perfect.
yes, it's fine.
Okay. So I think when the Zoom screen disappeared off of my screen, I was reading this passage from de Lauretis, where she talks about queer theory as a conceptually vacuous creature of the publishing industry. That's a pretty harsh dismissal. And there are ways in which it was fair. In the mid-1990s, queer theory really became focused very heavily on literary studies, very heavily on literary studies of white cisgender male authors and white cisgender male audiences. Gay, mind you, but not what de Lauretis had envisioned. By the end of the 1990s, though, we see the first wave of people, sometimes who had studied with the folks who were developing queer theory, sometimes people who were developing their own work newly in that direction, who are bringing that intersectionality back. There's a very strong now, a very strong body of work in queer of color critique. There's much more transnational work in queer studies, and certainly a lot more work on questions of gender that were not showing up in the early 1990s. transgender studies gets its start, again, same time period. And that there's an interesting question of intellectual history there as to why so much is shifting right at this time. Some of it in queer and trans studies especially has to do with the cultural changes that are coming about because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but that's not the only piece. There's a number of other things that may be going on. I don't have all the answers, but I think it's an interesting question. So transgender studies starts at the same time as the development of the transgender rights movement. So again, there's a longer history here. The transgender rights movement as a self-identified and also externally recognized movement really forms in the very early 1990s. The roots it's nascent in the late 80s. People aren't sure exactly who first used the word transgender, but most people cite uses in the 1980s. Prior to that, there are other terms that people are using, and also much more fuzziness in a number of global North, global West countries, much more fuzziness around the distinction that people make today in these kinds of political circles between sexuality and gender. So for much of the 20th century, as the legacy of the European sexologists who were writing in the 19th century, for much of the 20th century, gender variance and same-sex desire were understood to be tied. And it was in the 80s and 90s that those start to get split apart. Again, it's a whole lecture to talk about why that might have happened. But that's a piece helping us understand why queer studies and transgender studies, sometimes called trans studies, are separate, why they're closely related and yet understood as different fields. Susan Stryker gives a definition of transgender studies in the Transgender Studies Reader, which I highly recommend if you need I won't say quick because it's about that thick and there are 2 volumes making it doubly thick, but a comprehensive introduction to the state of transgender studies, including earlier work, which is not comfortable to read for people who identify as transgender, it must be said, but earlier work that many people are referring back to when the work first starts in transgender studies to undo some of the more trans exclusionary or trans antagonistic perspectives of earlier scholarship. So Stryker writes, and just reading here for anybody who doesn't have visual, transgender studies is concerned with anything that disrupts, here's that word again, denaturalizes, rearticulates, and makes visible the normative linkages we generally assume to exist between the biological specificity of the sexually differentiated human body, the social roles and statuses that a particular form of body is expected to occupy, the subjectively gendered relationship between a gendered sense of self. Did I say subjectively experienced? I may have misread that. The subjectively experienced relationship between a gendered sense of self and social expectations of gender role performance and the cultural mechanisms that work to sustain or thwart specific configurations of gendered personhood. That's a big definition because it's a big field. I think most of us have probably tried to define religious studies before and ended up with something similarly complicated. But just to give a very brief summary, we could say that transgender studies is focused on asking provocative and disruptive questions, again, similar to queer theory, about the relationships between embodiment, culture, and gender. So as you can see, I think even if you're new to these fields, the potential for combining queer studies, transgender studies, and religious studies is enormous. This is not something that many people in queer studies and transgender studies tend to see. It's not something that all religionists tend to see, but at least those of us who are used to doing this kind of thinking about the intersections between religion and gender, between religion and social power, see this connection very, very strongly. So let me talk just a little bit about a broad outline of queer and trans studies in religion. Interestingly, again, it's hard to mark origins, but I would claim that queer studies in religion and also trans studies in religion begin within a few years of the beginning of queer studies and trans studies themselves. They move into the study of religion really quite quickly, but they don't get a foothold until probably the first decade of the 21st century, and they have a very solid foothold, I would say, now. Let's see now, my computer is not forwarding my slides. There we go. All right. So the main themes in queer and trans studies in religion, and I want to stress that this is not an exhaustive list, and these themes are also not mutually exclusive. Many of us engage in more than one of these themes at a time in the projects that we're doing. So certainly studying same-sex desire and or gender variance in religious traditions, and here I'm intentionally not saying LGBT people, and I'll come back to why that is in a minute. Some people take textual approaches, historical approaches, certainly interpretive approaches as well in what some people call the more confessional side of religious studies, studying representations in art, but also the artists themselves, and certainly studying contemporary relationships between same-sex desire, gender variance, and religion. There's also approaches, certainly this is one of mine, to studying self-identified individuals and communities, so people that use terms or have self-understandings that connect them with same-sex desire and or gender variance, individuals and communities, and again, studying their relationship to religion. Certainly studying the tensions and the intersections between the first part, right, relationships between same-sex desire, gender variance, and religious traditions themselves versus the individuals that identify that way. And also the intersections. So again, just as with the story of the relationship between gender, sexuality, and religion more broadly, while it's not uncommon, and this is part of why there's such resistance to queer and trans studies in religion among queer studies and trans studies scholars, it's fairly common to assume that the only relationship, I often say the only relationship between queerness, transness, and religion is no. It's a much more complicated story than that, and if it weren't, we'd be done, and there would be no more subfield because we would have said all that there is to say. So also looking at the intersections and looking at the complex interactions that take place. Studying the links between all of what I've listed so far and other social, cultural, or political institutions, and then applying queer studies and or trans studies principles to the broader study of religion. So asking questions about the study of religion, about how we define religion that might not be asked in other contexts, but that queer studies and trans studies in particular invite us or press us to ask. Final piece that I want to talk about here, and then I'll wrap, again, just to pick up a very common question that's often raised. So the word queer in particular is a global north, global west term. Transgender is a term that was developed again in a global north, global west setting as a way of pushing back, as queer did, against a more medicalizing term. I want to pause and acknowledge here that I get the paired term global north, global west from the organizers of the Queer Paradigms Conference in Vienna several years ago. That conference was focused on queer studies in Eastern Europe and Western Asia, and particularly in former Soviet bloc countries. And those organizers really helped me to develop a language to talk not around, but with the limitations of both global north and Western as terms, since both of them are appropriate terms. So they've combined them, and I tend to use that. I tend to use that paired terminology now. So the question often comes up, and certainly the Roman Catholic Church has a pope right now who's putting this question in front of people as well. Is gender theory a Western thing? Is it in and of itself colonial? This question's been raised about feminism as well. As again, I imagine you're all quite familiar with. And we also see, particularly in the context of people wanting to argue for queer exclusive or homophobic political positions, the argument that homosexuality is something that was imported with European colonization and that is not an indigenous part of the culture that the person is talking about. So my answer to these questions is yes and no. Being a good queer theorist, I tend to deal in uncertainties, and I like it that way. I think probably being a good religionist, I tend to deal in uncertainties. So a few pieces, again, that I want to mention here just very quickly as a way of engaging with that question. First and most importantly, and this is why I avoided identity terms earlier, same-sex desire and gender variance and same-sex eroticism, from the evidence we have, appear extremely widely across human cultures and across history. You can never make a totalizing argument. I'm not going to tell you that they appear in every place and every time, because we simply can't prove that. But it seems quite clear that human same-sex desire, same-sex eroticism, and individual variance from the gender norms in a given society are pretty widespread. So they're also addressed in very early religious texts from a number of different religious traditions. So again, I think we have pretty broad evidence that, at least in terms of the experiences of humans, something's going on here that's pretty widespread and that didn't just come in with Europe. Of course, many activists in the global South, global East, make the counter argument that it was homophobia that was imported from Europe. Again, I think the picture's a little more complicated than either one of those being strictly true for all cases in all times. What I think is the other piece that's important to have here is the piece of social construction. So again, I imagine this is a concept that's familiar to many in our audience today, but just as a very brief gloss, thinking about the ways in which, not that things are invented, although my students love it when I say that religion is socially constructed, and they're very upset when I then go on to say that doesn't mean that people are just making it up to confuse other people or to oppress them. But rather the fact that cultures choose to assign meaning to specific aspects of human experience and choose not to assign meaning to other aspects. So social construction is about which aspects of human experience do cultures choose to focus on, choose to assign meaning to, which do they not, and what sorts of meanings get assigned to those aspects of human experience, be they anatomy, physiology, or something much more complicated. So that means that meaning is assigned to some kinds of sexual desires and not others in most cultures, but which kinds of sexual desires have meaning and which don't varies. Likewise with sexual acts, sexual positions, and likewise with gender variance, what is noticeable as gender variance and what isn't, again, varies from culture to culture quite significantly. Sometimes gender variance and same-sex desire are linked. So having one indicates that you have the other, or being one indicates that you are the other. Sometimes they're utterly separate. Sometimes it varies. They're linked in some cases and not in others, and the linkage may itself carry meanings, or the lack of the linkage may carry meanings. Sometimes same-sex desire is understood as a permanent aspect of a person's nature, likewise with gender variance. Sometimes it's understood as temporary, as a phase, the term that so many people hate. And sometimes it's understood as something that you engage in ritually. Again, this is something that probably a number of you already have encountered in your own work or write about. Sometimes gender variance and same-sex desire are structured within a society as binary. You are this or you're that, and there are only two options. You're gay or you're straight, for instance. You're trans or you're cisgender. Sometimes it's a spectrum. Sometimes it varies over time. For instance, in cultures in which women who are postmenopausal are understood to be gender variant. They're understood to be a different gender from women who are in, let's say, their childbearing years. Sometimes same-sex desire and gender variance are condemned. Sometimes they're celebrated. Sometimes they're irrelevant. Sometimes one is condemned and one is not. Again, huge variations here. Very few religious traditions have structured same-sex desire and gender variance in the same way consistently across time periods, across branches of the religion, across schools of thought, or across regions. There's almost never one answer to what religion X says about these issues. So for all of those reasons, this field exists. And for all of those reasons, it's a lot more complicated than these arguments that I have here on the screen. On the other hand, phrases like LGBTQ, terms like gay, lesbian, trans, or transgender are originally Global North, Global West terms. They're terms that travel with Global North, Global West money and political power. They're terms that activists in the Global South and Global East have to make very savvy decisions about engaging with, because on the one hand, the entire structuring of gender and sexuality that come with those terms may not fit the structuring of gender and sexuality that are a part of that culture. At the same time, sometimes if you use indigenous terminology, the money from the grant-making societies in the wealthy countries or the political support doesn't come. And so activists in the Global South and Global East have learned to be extraordinarily strategic about their mobilization of these terms. In some cases, the terms get adopted and shifted, and they have their own meaning within that particular culture or that region. In other times, the terms are used in specific kinds of communication, be it tourism or engaging with non-governmental organizations, and again, grant-making, political, diplomatic agencies transnationally. Sometimes people will use one set of terminology in their own communities and another set to communicate out from those communities. So can we use these terms across cultures and historical periods? That gets trickier. Some people argue that we have to have some kind of shared terminology. Same-sex desire and gender variance is a very awkward and wordy way of talking about things. Other people point out that whatever single term we pick is almost inevitably, if we use it globally and transhistorically, going to be imperialist or appropriative. In other words, the same power dynamic, but whose term do we pick to use? Also, these terms don't refer to the same thing. So the Buddhism scholar Jose Cabezon asks, for instance, how we should translate the word pandaka. Is a pandaka really a gay person, a lesbian person, a transgender person? Not really. And when we engage in that kind of translation, we also potentially play into oppressive state logics that are using exactly that kind of slippery translation to justify criminalization. There are also global North logics at work here, again, that insist on the use of these kinds of terms to unlock resources. So I think that this kind of work can be generatively adapted and used in contexts around the world of queer and trans studies, because ultimately queer and trans studies are about asking questions and not imposing answers. So in my own work, I follow the terms that people are using rather than translating. And when I generalize, I don't use terms like queer or trans unless I'm working in a context where those terms are widely used and accepted. Then in those cases I may. So let me stop there. I was hoping for a quarter till the hour, and we're 10 till the hour. I'll let our hosts decide exactly when we're stopping. They know that I can go past the hour if we need to. But let me take my slides down and find out what kinds of questions you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilcox. This was fantastic. I think especially the work around nomenclature and naming and labeling, I think really transcends context, really works across lots of the different spaces that many of the people listening and who will watch later are working in. So we're really grateful. If folks who are participating have not yet dropped their name and email in the chat, we would love for you to do that. If you entered late or had to come and go, you can also add questions to the chat, or you can simply unmute yourself. We're a small enough group, and ask Dr. Wilcox your questions directly. I know that she's looking forward to hearing what people have to say, both comments and questions. And we have 10 or 15 minutes left in our time together to engage. So thank you again, and the floor is open for questions and comments.
So I think I will start. I would love to ask you to elaborate a bit on this idea that you do not use the LGBTQ term. Maybe you can expand because in the research I'm conducting, I am using it, and this seems to be the term that is also widely used within community in my own country. So maybe you can reflect about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, and for the opportunity to expand on that, because I was moving quickly enough that I didn't have a chance to unpack it more. When I'm working with communities that use those terms, I use those terms. Because of my work in queer studies and queer theory, I lean toward queer rather than LGBTQ. I lean towards queer and trans. One of the things that I think is important so there are reasons to use each, and I do switch in my publishing. Sometimes it has to do with the people that I'm writing for. Sometimes it has to do with the audience that they're expecting. Most of all, I want the language to translate. I don't mean literally translate necessarily from one language to another, but from one cultural context to another. So I want to be using words that express what I'm trying to express in the context of the people who are going to be reading or hearing me. But when I am writing, when I'm writing about a particular community or a particular group of people, I follow the language that they use. When I default to queer, it's because I'm not talking about a specific bounded community or a specific group of people, but I'm generalizing about people that include a large number of folks who would identify with the word queer. When I switch to same-sex desire and gender variance, it's when I'm generalizing across such a broad spectrum of cultures and or of historical time periods that the other terminology starts to become not just inaccurate, but anachronistic and even misleading. So I will use any of those depending on the context, and there's often a fair amount of thought that goes into which I'm using. The other thing that I do want to flag, the one thing that I think we have to be particularly cautious with when we're using one of the many possible acronyms, LGBTQ is the most common one right now, is I feel that it's quite important to be sure that if we're using that acronym, we're actually talking about all of the people named by that acronym. It's very common right now for people to default to LGBTIQ when they're talking solely about sexuality, and to even then generalize and say LGBTQ people and sexuality in the same sentence. What that misses is the fact that trans identities are gender identities. They're not sexual identities. It's also not uncommon for people to use LGBTIQ when talking solely about people, or let me change that sentence, when not talking about bisexual people. So these are both bi communities, and trans communities are both communities that are often marginalized in broader queer communities and that have been marginalized in research as well. So I think we do need to be careful to use the terms that actually match what we're talking about. Some people use LGBTQ, and again, as long as bisexual people are a part of the conversation, then yes, that makes sense. That is another reason to default to queer, but queer doesn't work with all audiences, and some communities are uncomfortable with it, in which case then it's very much not the word to use. So yeah, I don't have a lot of pat answers, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Rosalind.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wilcox. This has been fascinating. And I want to follow up with what you were just, how you ended there. I want to know how you, as a scholar of religion, kind of navigate and factor in all the various communities, whether they are official, unofficial, social media community, national, UN, that are generating discourse and terminology. I mean, it seems that it could be overwhelming. I mean, I track indigenous, for example, and indigeneity and how that is evolving. But it seems like yours is even more complex and almost more rapidly evolving. And it seems like, to do justice to the generational differences, you've got to take account of youth, right, and how could you speak to that, about how you would what do you say to grad students or undergrads, and do you focus on one community? I mean, you hinted at earlier that some of the communities or constituencies you talk about actually don't pay much attention to religion. So does that put more onus on you as a scholar of religion to somehow play that important role of trying to collate and sort out this kind of maelstrom of terminologies and nomenclatures?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I would say that this is a very similar situation in terms of the shifting terminology, the regional variants, and the global politics of terminology to indigeneity. I think it's quite similar. And of course, it intersects with it, particularly when we're talking about gender variants, because more and more Native and Indigenous communities are using their own terminology for gender variants, which again flags a different kind of identity than trans does. I don't have an easy answer, but I think humility actually has to be a really important part of it, and listening. I am always behind my students. I am always catching up on shifts in how they're understanding things, but I'm simultaneously watching shifts in the language that people use for themselves within, let's say, my classrooms, and how far those terms are going. So I haven't used the term non-binary a lot today because in my understanding, that's a term that has not gotten very global. Trans has, but in a complicated manner, politically complicated manner. It will be interesting to see what happens with non-binary. And so it's about, again, it's about, as you say, it's about trying to watch and listen and be really attentive to how the term is shifting in usage, to notice even when a new term, I've learned a lot of my terminology from my social media. So somebody uses a new term and I think, oh, okay, who's using that now? What exactly does it mean? How do I come to understand it? How do I work that into my research? Because I want people to see themselves in my work. This is so much what we've talked about for decades in terms of why this work matters. It matters for many, many reasons, but for me in particular in the classroom, it's about the Adrienne Rich line from Identity in Academe about never wanting any of my students to look into a mirror and see nothing.
If I may ask another question, I don't see other hands, so I don't want to dominate here, but seems to be that for me, you're really touching very important questions, especially as I'm working now on this topic with the empirical data. I actually followed your book on lesbian, religious lesbians. And I was wondering, actually, for me as sociologist, I'm interested not only in LGBTQ religions, but also in being non-religious, and how this identity really is manifesting. And so I wonder, in your work, you have been writing on religious lesbians. And you mentioned that you have this limitation that you were not able to reach, or you did not try in that particular research to reach the non-religious lesbians. But I wonder, have you tried at some point in your career to talk as a scholar of religion to queer people about being non-religious and what does it mean to them? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And this is such an important topic in the study of religion, regardless of what field we're coming from. I often tell people that I'm half sociologist, half historian, and half theorist, and it adds up to more than one on purpose. Because of the way, other than so talking only about monographs here, about my book length research projects, other than the first one where I was recruiting specifically within churches, and so I wasn't running across a lot of secular people, although they're there in the Metropolitan Community Church because they're coming for other reasons, and because the Metropolitan Community Church is not particularly strictly doctrinal, and so there's a lot of leeway for people to be involved. In that second book in queer women and religious individualism, and I use queer there incidentally because the folks in that study, some identified as lesbian, some identified as bi, some identified as queer. A number of them used multiple, shifted between multiple terms depending on context. I actually specifically said in my recruitment efforts that I wanted to talk to people about religion, regardless of what their opinion was. And there are a few people in there who are pretty anti-religion. I love the story from one woman I interviewed who told me that Jehovah's Witnesses came knocking one day, and she said, well, sure, why not? I'm open to everybody. I'd like to learn what you have to teach. And after several Bible study sessions with them, she said, I'm sorry, there is just too much sex and violence in your religion, and I'm really over it. And she sent them away. And yet, there's some questions here about the definition of religion, I think, which I always get delighted by. And yet, the spirit of her dead brother visited her regularly. So, but she would never tell you that she was either religious or spiritual. And that's the kind of, that's where I think I'm particularly interested, and perhaps this is why I'm so drawn to queer studies too. I think I'm particularly interested is when when things don't go the way they're supposed to. They don't fit in the categories. So here's this person who is absolutely resolutely not religious and not spiritual, but her brother visits her on a regular basis from who knows where, because she's not religious or spiritual, so she doesn't have a world concept to really fit that into. So they're there in the studies. They're certainly there in my work with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence as well. But the minute you tell somebody you're a religious studies scholar and they're secular, most of them don't want to talk to you. And I actually, there are some sisters, I did a lot of field work with the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, and I often convinced people to talk to me in interviews just when we were walking from, place to place doing what the sisters call bar ministry. And I definitely had a conversation with the sister where I sort of sidled up and said, so when do I get to sit down with you with my recorder? And she responded, oh, you don't want to talk to me. And I said, well, why ever not? And she said, well, because I'm not religious, but I want to talk about religion. I don't, right? So that I think has been the biggest challenge. Now, because I'm particularly interested in things that go against the standard narrative, and the standard narrative is that queer and trans people aren't religious. So I get interested in the projects that are saying something a little bit different, that are doing something a little more complicated. That's not to say that studying secularism is not complicated. I don't mean it that way, but it's not, that one is not my work. But it's work that really has not been sufficiently done. And I think it's in part because scholars in queer and trans studies and religion have had to work so hard to prove to everyone else that the number of times that I had people dismiss my work early on in my career because it was too narrow, because, well, there can't be hardly any of those people who are religious. So, why does that work even matter? You should do a little article on that and then go on and do something more meaningful. I think we've spent so long fighting that assumption that that people have been very cautious about studying secularism in queer and trans communities, and it's important. So I'm glad you're doing that work, and I think we need to see more. I see we have a question in the text as well. Sorry, in the chat as well.
Yeah, so perhaps we'll use that as our last question, Professor Wilcox, and then we'll do just a quick closing, Milda and I.
That's fine. Let me go ahead and read it again for people who either aren't seeing or don't have visual. Hi, Professor Wilcox. This is Bella Penn from Mount Holyoke College. My partner went to Mount Holyoke. Happy just past Mountain Day. I'm a rising junior studying anthropology. I tried to use my microphone, but it failed to work somehow. As I know, queer religiosity is a field growing real fast, and as an outsider, I'm really curious, what are the popular topics queer religionist scholars focus on? If you don't feel comfortable speaking for other scholars, can you introduce and share more about your own research and work? Yeah, lots, so much, Bella. This field is exploding in really, really exciting ways. And especially trans studies, I think, has finally gotten off the ground as well. That's not to say that queer studies isn't also still really burgeoning, but that I'm excited to see trans studies and religion finally, not for lack of effort, because people have been writing trans studies and religion since the 90s, but being able to get past the transphobia in the academy has been a huge climb. We're in no way past it, but there's enough opening in the field now that people are starting to be able to do their work and make a career out of it. Oh my gosh, what they're doing, so much. What are the popular topics? I can't narrow it down. Everything from, so I'm just going to list some things off the top of my head. If I had another 2 minutes, I would open up my file where I keep notes on the most recent books that have been released. But my own work is my own current work, as current as it can be, given that we're still in quarantine. I'm still in quarantine. Is on people who see connections between spirituality or religion and leather and BDSM practices. There is work. I have we have an alum from my department who is asking questions about Roman Catholic ethics and how Roman Catholic social ethics have become really forward-looking on questions of colonialism, questions of poverty, questions of the environment, under Francis especially, a number of different issues where the Roman Catholic Church has really taken a leadership role, and yet is nowhere near that on questions that surround gender and sexuality, whether we're talking about women's ordination, whether we're talking about the right to access safe abortion, which we're increasingly losing in the United States, whether we're talking about trans issues, asking questions about how did those two get separated? What exactly happened historically to lead to such very different directions on these different topics? I have another student. It just so happens I have a few students working in the area of Christianity. I've had a few students working in the area of Christianity recently. So I have another student who's, another former student working on bringing trans studies perspectives to ancient Christianity and rethinking how we tell the stories of early Christian leaders who were assigned female at birth, but who lived as men. And we've told their stories for a long time as stories of women dressing as men. We would never, or I hope, use that language for trans people today. Now, no one's arguing that those women or those people identified as transgender, but rather that we also can't take our binary understanding of gender that is common today and assign it back into history to them, because in the Roman Empire, gender worked differently. So those kinds of questions are some that we can ask. There are folks doing this work in nearly every area of religious studies now. There's a lovely article out a couple of years ago from a scholar of theater studies, actually, who asks questions about performance, working, you may be familiar with the term hijra. She's actually working with people who use the language of Khwaja Sira instead in Pakistan. So these are Muslim women who were assigned male at birth, who are engaging in a very traditional gender variant role, and yet are also facing very serious transphobic oppression, and are using their traditional religious role to fight back against that oppression, such as engaging in widely recognizable ritual activities in a protest outside a police department. There's so much more. And I want to be sure that we share my email address. So anyone who has further questions that they're not comfortable, I'll put it in the chat. Anyone who has further questions that you're not comfortable asking or that we've run out of time for, please feel free to email me. We are only just starting our second full week of classes here at UC Riverside. So if I don't respond right away, it's not personal. It's because I literally can't keep on top of everything.
Thank you so much. This has been really rich, and it's very generous of you to offer additional follow-ups, and we're really grateful. So again, whether silently or with our reactions, we give you a warm round of applause for this wonderful presentation and for engaging with us and sharing your expertise. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
I'm already getting messages from folks who are saying, when will the recording be available? I had to leave, or I couldn't come. Could you make it available? I myself have class. It's the middle of the day here and different times in other places. Some people who wanted to attend are sleeping at this time. So we know that the recording will also be richly enjoyed by folks. I'll ask maybe Milda to share about our upcoming webinar in November, and then I'll close it out by telling you about the first one of the new year as we look ahead to 2022.
Thank you, Amy. I would like to invite all of you to join us for the next webinar on November 8th, where we will be discussing together with colleagues from Poland and Ukraine about the LGBTQ religion in these countries. As you probably know, Pew Research Centers shows that Europe is divided according to the public attitudes towards LGBTQ people and same-sex partnership. And this division is becoming more and more complicated in trying to find dialogue between these two parts of Europe. And inevitably, we think that this is also related to a certain aspects of religious life in these societies. So during next webinar, we will be talking about experiences of LGBTQ individuals in Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. We will be able to compare their experiences in Catholic and Orthodox dominated societies. And I think it will be very interesting discussions, and all of you, please join us. You are very welcome. And I'm looking forward to see you, and the advertisement will be disseminated in the near future.
So our first webinar of 2022, and we haven't settled on a date in either January or February yet, because the scholars who will be presenting don't yet have their winter teaching schedules finalized, but we'll have a transnational research team with one member from the US and one from Canada and one from India and one from Italy. And these 4 women collaborators are working on a project titled Beyond Mother Goddesses: New Directions for International Scholarship on Motherhood and Religious Studies. And this project has been supported by a collaborative international research grant from the American Academy of Religion. And they're conducting a series of interviews with scholars and also engaging in some limited fieldwork as is possible during the pandemic. And they expect to have their findings basically finalized by January, and we will be one of the first venues that they'll present to. So a sort of working talk or a working paper as they move toward publication. So we're looking forward to that, as well as our first webinar of 2022. So 2 events to look forward to for the moment. And as we close out, we'll just thank Dr. Wilcox again for her time and her expertise and also her generosity. Thank you, friends. Have a great day.
Thank you all.